Hope you're all doing well. For all of our complexity and all of our diversity, all the ways that we differ from one another, think so?
I think so.
Sorry, let me just check that chirp. That is my volume control, so it's not that. I don't know what that is, but I think we're going to have to deal with it. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know. It sounds like a fan or something up in the ceiling. Okay, so for all of our complexity and all of our diversity, we're in, most of us, not all of us, but most of us either identify as male or female. And most of us, when we're in relationships, not all of us, but most of us, tend to think of ourselves as interested in being in a relationship with somebody of the same sex as us, which we would say that's a gay person. That is a person who is interested in same-sex relationships, or they're straight, and that is a person who's interested in relationships with a member of the other sex. Not the opposite sex, because they're not opposites, but the other sex. So most of us, so most of us are described by these two, and I'm going to call them binary, meaning they take on two values, even though we know that there are people who don't fit neatly into those categories. For the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to focus on those who do. Most of us are described in these ways. And so we must ask, before we start to get into the complexity of our family backgrounds and our personalities, how we differ amongst one another, we have to look at these really finite, relatively small number of categories that most of us find ourselves in and understand how they affect our relationships. Smart people need to know the answers to these questions. Now more than ever, social roles are relaxed, so we need to know, is everything about us determined by the social roles that we adopt? Or is there a biological core to who we are as men and as women that is really going to be important and determine important experiences within our relationships? Smart people need to know the answer to that question. Smart people also need to know, in the midst of rapid, massive, very significant changes in the legalization of gay marriage, we need to have a perspective on what that means. Why does that matter? Is there something fundamentally different when it comes to intimacy between two people who are male and in the relationship, two people who are female in the relationship, or when there is a male and a female person in the relationship? Smart people need to know the answers to these questions, and today I want to help guide you toward what I believe are reasonable answers, reasonable perspectives to take on the contributions of gender and sexual orientation to experiences of intimacy in our closest social bonds. And today I want to start with the gender point, okay? I want to start with whether men and women are different in general and in their intimate relationships. I want to give you, more than anything, a smart way to think about this question, because it comes up all the time in our lives. It certainly came up for Albert Einstein. Here's what he said: women marry men hoping the men will change, men marry women hoping they will not, so each is inevitably disappointed. Now, we know this can't be true because not everybody is disappointed in their relationships. There are relationships that work out just fine. We all know that Albert Einstein was in a relationship with his cousin, so he may not be our best expert to turn to when it comes to advice on what happens in men's and women's relationships, but it at least gives us a point against which to argue that men and women may be more similar than they are different. But popular culture really emphasizes differences between men and women. So here's Here's a magazine cover. It's actually quite old now, of a man and a woman about to get married. The idea being that by virtue of their very biologies, that they would be positioned to argue with one another. That there is a battle of the sexes, and that somehow, in order to have good relationships, we have to understand how men and women are different from one another and make accommodations for that, right? So many of our expectations, often because biological sex is so easy for us to encode in another person. We see it usually very clearly, very quickly. We recognize it, and so we assume that there are very profound differences that exist between men and women. We need to make sense of those differences. We need to know where they might exist, where they don't exist, how big they are, right? That's a question. It's not just whether men and women are similar or different, but how similar, and how would you ever know something like that? Well, it turns out that many, many studies of male-female differences have been conducted. And by many, many, I mean thousands upon thousands of studies. So in this literature now, where people study men, group of women, assess each group in some way, and then compare how similar or different they are, right? That's the basic idea. That because that's an easy study to do, there are many such studies. And now it's come to the point where nobody really reads the individual studies anymore until somebody else has written a review of several hundred studies at a time. And so those are called, and I think we use this word in chapter 4, maybe the methods chapter, I'm not sure. These are called meta-analyses, right? So these are analyses of other analyses. So these are sort of cumulative indices of how men and women differ. And now it's gotten to the point where nobody even reads the meta-analyses, but somebody meta-analyzes the meta-analyses, and now those are called mega-analyses. So there are thousands of studies like this, okay? And here's how they go. I get a group of men and a group of women. Most people know which group they fall in. If they don't know, you can clearly figure this out. And then give them a test. I'm going to give you an example of empathy, okay, as an example. So I could watch you be empathic with a baby or a dog or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or I could give you a questionnaire assessing how empathic you are. Maybe I could ask your friends how empathic you are. We have ways of assessing that. We would call that the dependent variable, right? That's the outcome that we would be caring about. The independent variable in this case would be whether you are male or female. Right? And there are lots of different scenarios that might come from a study like that. One is to say, and this is the top panel on the left there, that men and women are actually identical. This is a possible outcome. Right? Men and women are identical, and so what you have are two, what we would think of as bell-shaped distributions, and they overlap perfectly. There is an average for the men and an average for the women. They overlap. It's the same average. It's not statistically different. And even still, there's going to be variability around that average, right? So even within a group of men or within a group of women, there's going to be some people who are really empathic and some people who are not empathic at all, depending on how we've defined that, right? So we've got a mean, right? And we've got a standard deviation around that mean. But it gets represented as something you're familiar with, I suspect, these bell-shaped curves. If those two distributions, we would call those distributions of scores, you might also remember the word histogram, these are histograms, they overlap entirely. We would say that D up there between them, the difference is a 0, okay? And what you do is you subtract one mean, you don't need to know this, you subtract one mean from the other mean, you divide it by the standard deviation, and there's a way of computing a number that tells you this D, or different statistic. Another possibility is that females are a little bit more empathic than men. And now I've got a D of 0.4, all right? And now they start to separate a little bit, right? So now in this case, I've shown that women are a little bit further on the right, they're higher in empathy, and men are a little bit shaded to the left. So now the means separate, and you still see the distributions, right? Now, I want to give you a number. That D equals 0.85 in the bottom panel there, that is actually pretty close graphic representation of what a D equals 0.85 looks like. Okay, so I just want to give you a number, a reference point, 0.85. And what you notice is there's separation between the means. You see that? How they're gradually pulling apart as that D number gets bigger. Standard deviations I've left the same. Those don't change. But what you see is a lot of overlap between men and women, right? You see how much overlap there is? You've got a group of females here that right in the middle of that, you've got men and women who are really undifferentiated from one another. There's a lot of overlap. Even with a number that we would call D equals 0.85, more women tend to be a lot like men, right? It's not as though those distributions are totally separated. They overlap a lot, right? So now I want to tell you about what some of these meta-analyses look like. What's really cool is if you do these studies right, you can quantify them in a way that allows you to talk in the same language across all of these studies. And that's the D statistic. It's sort of the common language, the common metric that we can use across all these studies, and allows us to summarize them. So if you've already seen this in the textbook, and I hope you have, you'll know that there are differences, right? So men tend to be more aggressive than women. D equals 0.66. Men tend to be more assertive in conversation than women. D equals 0.49. Men tend to look for really attractive mates more so than women do. Attraction, physical attraction, is more important when men are seeking mates than when women are seeking mates. D equals 0.54 over a bunch of studies, right? Men are much more interested in casual sex than women are. D equals 0.81. What's interesting, though, is that 0.81 value is a lot like this 0.85 value, right? And what that means is that there are a lot of women who are at least as interested in casual sex as men are. There's a lot of overlap, right? It's only when you get out to some physical features of our bodies, like how far men and women can throw a ball, that you really start to see bigger differences. And even then, they're only in the 2-3 range. The D statistics only go out to 2 or 3. I don't care if you know these D statistics. That's not what I want you to know. What I want you to know is that when we compute these statistics, we see a lot of overlap, right? It looks like these distributions down here, they overlap a lot. It's not as though men and women are separable in a really distinct way, even when it comes to something like casual sex. There's overlap. When it comes to support seeking, now the sign on the D statistic flips to a negative. And that means that women, when they're distressed, are more likely to seek support from another person than men are. Okay? Women are also more likely to describe themselves as oriented toward tenderness and emotion than men are. Okay? You see that's a negative. That's the biggest one. There's others in the book that you'll see, but that's the biggest one. The point is that if we look at any given dimension, empathy, seeking beauty, casual sex, assertiveness, you'll see a whole list in the book. The differences between men and women are quite small. And that's because there's profound diversity even within our genders. So even in this room, there are some guys who are really stereotypical guys, right? Who are going to be high in aggression, high in assertiveness, really want the best-looking babe in the bar, really be interested in casual sex, not at all interested in seeking support, feelings, I don't even believe they exist, and tenderness, that's for wimps, and please give me another beer because I'm watching a football game, right? But there's other guys who are the exact opposite. The exact opposite, right? Within a gender, within men and within women, there are profound differences. And it's because of those differences that the overlap on any one of these different dimensions is so great. You got that? That's the point I want you to get. Then there's another point. Across these dimensions, they don't get organized randomly, right? So the similarities outweigh the differences, but a lot of little small differences add up to create different psychological spheres for men and women, right? So there are differences, and it just so happens that people who are more aggressive really don't identify themselves as being more tender, and that's what it means to be a guy, right? So the average guy really is different from the average woman when you take all of these factors simultaneously. Not when you consider them one at a time, because none of us are people in one dimension at a time. We're complex, multidimensional people. And when you consider all of these small dimensions simultaneously, you think of what a male person is in their totality and a female person is in their totality, there are different psychologies there, right? So it's interesting that, on average, men are really like women on lots of different dimensions. The overlaps are profound. But there are small differences, and they add up. They accumulate to create different intimate psychologies for men and women. Okay, so that's complicated. You can see why that doesn't get on the front page of the newspaper. There's subtlety there, right? We have to understand that there's lots of different dimensions, that we can quantify where men and women stand on those dimensions, that they make sense. Like, nobody's surprised to hear that guys like casual sex more than women. Nobody's surprised to hear that. But the fact that there's a lot of overlap in the distributions between men and women, and that there's plenty of guys who really aren't interested in casual sex at all, and plenty of women who are. That's a more gray area sort of argument. It's not the one you hear in the newspaper. It's not the one you hear in the news. It's not the one you see on the cover of a magazine. It's the kind of thing that you see in textbooks instead, because it requires a little subtlety. It requires a little sophistication in how you think about determining differences and the fact that they can be big and small, right? And then you have to take it one step further and recognize that they add up to be these interesting cumulative kinds of experiences. So we need to, yes? What was the actual finding for empathy? It's in the book. It's not huge, like 0.4 or something. So we have to explain these differences. And if you've read Chapter 4, you know that one of the approaches we take is from an evolved point of view. We talked about that in our class on Tuesday as a theoretical perspective. And this idea goes like this, that women orient toward others and seek protection. That's what we saw in one way of sort of abstracting a psychology for women, is that women, on average, tend to orient toward others and seek protection. Men tend to orient toward providing protection or defending things, being strong and being aggressive, being assertive. And they also are more sexually active. They're in the business of getting their genes into the next generation and fighting for those genes and fighting for more sexual opportunities, right? Why would that be? Because biologically, we said it on Tuesday, we're all here to send our genes into the next generation, and men and women have evolved to play different roles in procreation and caregiving. Okay? So men and women indisputably play different roles in creating new life. Right? And we have evolved on the basis of that biological built-in propensity. We have evolved to play specific roles in the process. Interestingly enough, the idea has been floated that by my colleague Shelley Taylor here in psychology, that part of what intimate relationships are is grafted onto this capacity that we have to be parental figures. That whatever parts of the brain are associated with nurturing another person or having sex with another person or being aggressive, that those sort of come into play as we each as men and women play a role in creating new life, that those are the same parts of the brain that we use throughout adulthood, that those become parts of what remains in play when we organize our relationships and our lives. So that is the evolved point of view, that men and women have evolved to play different roles in creating new life, and as a result, they differ. Okay, so here is a cartoon. The woman holding a spear to the guy says, on second thought, maybe it would be better if you hunt and I gather. The idea being that it's, even though in principle the woman would know how to hold a spear, would know how to use the spear, and would probably be really smart about exactly where to stick that spear into that big beast, the guy is, on average, bigger and stronger. There's biological preparedness that makes certain things easier and harder for men and women. Okay? And yet, what's interesting is all of the variation around the mean, right? All of the variation around the mean. Now, we think of that variation as being interesting because not all men are the same. You know this. Not all women are the same. Despite what we sometimes believe when we're in moments of great frustration, why are all men the same? Why are all women the same? It's not really the case. There are characteristics of men that make them much more similar to other men than women. That's definitely true. But what's interesting is the variability around the average, right? And that's what you're looking for when you're looking for a partner, is how is this guy different? How is this guy special? How is this woman different from the average? So when we think about what separates people away from the average is how they've been raised, how they've been nurtured, what societal roles enable people to do, what's easier and difficult from a societal standpoint to do as a man versus a woman, right? So what I call the nurture, socialization, and context perspective says that the biological view, yeah, there's a kernel of truth to that. We believe that there are differences in the roles that men and women play, but really what matters is, but that's just a starting point. What really matters is that we have great capacity. We have a kind of a plasticity as human beings, so that different environments enable us to do different things. And if you take stereotypic men and put them in environments where they're expected to be nurturing and caring, that they will rise to that challenge. They'll be really good at it, probably even indistinguishable from women. And that women, given sufficient opportunity, will also be able to rise to the challenge of leading countries, leading nations, leading corporations, really being aggressive, dominant, powerful figures. So the nature point of view says there's a biological core of who we are, and it's a reflection of the roles that we play in creating new life. The socialization perspective says, yeah, but let's not get too far past ourselves, because there's so much plasticity in what we're capable of doing. And with different expectations in socialization practices, sex differences should subside. So if we look in societies where men and women are allowed to take on different roles, differences between men and women tend to diminish. And that's interesting. Those studies are described in the book. One last thought. And so, for example, men can be very empathic and women can be great leaders when there's sufficient opportunities, incentives, and contingencies for that to happen. Question?
When it says this might be a starting point, is it referring to the evolutionary?
It's referring to the evolutionary point of view, right? The previous slide. So when it says this might be a starting point, that is the biological built-in evolved capacity that men and women have to create children in their own unique ways. So it has to be a combination of these two forces. Guaranteed it's going to be complicated. But what I want to give you next is a simple way of thinking about this. Simple but powerful, I think. And then I'm going to give you an example from a movie that helps you to illustrate how I think this plays out in our relationships. Because it's important to not just see this in the abstract. It's important to try to find ways in which this is true in our daily lives. So here is the idea that I want you to know about, and you will see this on the exam. If we look at the large literature on human sex differences, specifically in relation to what men and women do in relationships, and they're listed and really forms the bulk of Chapter 4. A lot of evidence suggests that men and women are equally interested in closeness and contact and being in relationships. Men and women want to be in relationships. Not all of the time. It's not the only way to live your life. I'm not saying that. But to relatively comparable degrees, men and women want to be close. Men and women want to be in relationships with someone of the same sex or the opposite sex. But they might go about meeting that need in different ways. Okay? It's important. The need is probably not fundamentally different, but it might mean different things to men and women. And I like to think, based on this really interesting paper by Roy Baumeister, a social psychologist at Florida State University, that we can think of women orienting as sort of a baseline default toward the horizon, toward the dyad, toward relationships on a level with other people, right? Whereas men are more oriented toward the group and the hierarchy. Men sort of want to know their place in the hierarchy. Women seem to have a slightly greater propensity to orienting toward other people on a dyadic level, on an even level. So I've got this on the horizon, because we're equivalent. I want to share. If I'm a female, my tendency is to want to connect up with another person and share something with them. Guys tend to think about where they are in the hierarchy. How do I get resources? How do I get above somebody? Who is above somebody? How can I cut them down? Right? That's the hierarchical view. There's a lot of evidence for this simple framework, this simple way to characterize men and women in their relationships. One is when you think about, yes, question?
Well, is this, how generalizable is this towards different cultures, across other societies, not just here?
This is assumed to be broadly generalizable. This is not just a phenomenon of the West and the wealthy. This is really assumed to be characteristic of men and women in general. It's a starting point, though, right? So it's sort of a default value. It's where, all else being equal, women and men, what they tend to do. But again, we have to recognize that there's great capacity to push this around. Women can get into the hierarchy and do quite well, thank you very much, when the opportunities present them. And men are quite capable of having really great dyadic relationships. But there still are differences that tend to show up across cultures. They also tend to be muted in cultures like the West, where people have more opportunities to inhabit different roles. So that's the idea. So there's a lot of evidence, and the text covers this pretty well. One of them is that men and women have more complicated thoughts about different things. So, for example, women, if you ask them about what's going on in their relationship, they have way more differentiated conceptions of what's going on and why than men do. But it's not that men have bad memories. If you ask men about NASCAR, if you ask men about National Football League, college football, college basketball, stock markets, they have plenty of knowledge. They're tracking it really closely, right? So it's not as though men and women differ dramatically in their cognitive capacity, but the detail that men and women have about their relationships differs in a way that favors women. And the detail that men and women have outside of relationships differs often in a way that favors men thinking in a hierarchical way. Okay? Men and women both like to talk to women when they're upset. Right? So I'm struggling a little bit, and I'm a guy. Well, guess what? I'm more likely to seek out my best female friend than my best guy friend. Women are more likely to seek out another woman as well. Just to talk. I just want to talk. I need to talk with somebody about this. Women tend to be really good sources of emotional nurturing and support, and men and women both know that. It doesn't mean that guys can't be really good at that. It's absolutely not the case. But it tends to not be the default setting. It tends not to be the way things go. Men and women tend to have affairs for different reasons in relationships. Men tend to have affairs, guess why? To put their genes into the future? Sometimes they use condoms, and then it's just for sexual pleasure. Women have extramarital affairs for sex, but they're way more likely to fall in love with the person that they had sex with than men are. Okay? They're different. There's a difference in how affairs play out. Guess who is more likely to suggest within a couple that they go see a marital therapist? Women. Women by a huge margin. Guess who's more likely to suggest that a relationship should end? Women. Women are tracking the problems way earlier. It's part of that complexity of thought thing, right? It's not to say that a lot of guys don't end relationships, they do. But women are tracking the problems long before the guys are even on the scene. Like, what do you mean we're having a problem? I don't get it, right? So men and women sort of have different conceptions and different schemes of how they think about relationships. Now, one of the things I really like to do is A, read the New Yorker magazine, which I recommend to all of you, and B, look at the cartoons in the New Yorker and then flip the genders. Okay? So let's look at this one. So here's a guy on a couch and a woman to his left, and she says, "I wish you'd open up to me. I need some ammunition." Right? The guy is oriented toward keeping his role as having some power in that relationship. He's saying, no, no, no. If I tell you things, you're going to want to talk to me about stuff. I don't want that. I want to sort of maintain my power and my control over myself and who I am. Now, and she wants closeness. She said, I want to connect with you. I want to know more about you. Let's share stuff. And he says, let's share stuff about NASCAR. How about that? Now, imagine that you would reverse the roles. And it's the guy saying, I wish you'd open up to me. I need some ammunition. Now it sounds creepy, right? Now it sounds like he's going to actually use the ammunition to hurt her, right? It's a totally different cartoon when you switch the roles. Here's an even better one. Here's a guy, blue-collar guy, you can see, right? He's got his work clothes on. He's heading out in the morning. His wife, we assume to be his wife. Looks like his mother, kind of, but it's probably his wife. And she says, "You forgot the launch codes," and hands him his lunchbox. Now, what's his reaction? Ouch. I am a guy, I'm a blue-collar guy, I'm going to get in my truck, I'm going to do some dirty hard work, and I'm going to make money for this family. And when we say, this is sort of a cultural reference, when we say, here's the launch codes, that's a reference to the President of the United States has a suitcase that has missile launch codes in it, and it actually goes with the President wherever he goes, even today. Right? So the President Obama, wherever he is this far away from a suitcase that has launch codes for launching ballistic missiles anywhere in the world. It's true. So she's sort of saying this to him, like, you have no power whatsoever in this world. Okay? I think that's what this cartoon says. Now flip that around. So it's the wife going to work. Maybe she's, working in an insurance company, something, whatever would be the comparable thing for her to do. And him saying, you forgot the launch codes. That sounds weird. It doesn't even make sense, right? What are you talking about, launch codes? She'd say, go play computer games. Get out of here. I'm going to work. It doesn't make sense. But if he said something like, I guess you'll be eating alone again today. Here's your lunch. That hurts. For him, that wouldn't hurt so much. It's like, yeah, I like thinking about cars. I'll be on my smartphone, reading the news, whatever. I sort of like being by myself. But if his implication was, you have no friends and everybody at your office doesn't like you and you're eating alone, that hurts, right? You see the difference. If you flip the genders in these cartoons, it means something completely different. This plays on the idea that guys are supposed to have authority and power and stature in the world. Women, on the other hand, go out into the world looking for relationships. Now, that's a gross exaggeration, but you see the idea that there's an orientation toward the hierarchy for men and toward the dyadic, equal-level relationships for women. Now, I want to show you a video clip from Knocked Up. Now, there's some colorful language in this movie, so I want to caution you. If you're sensitive at all, you might want to leave now. It's not that bad, but it's colorful. You'll see. So this is Seth Rogen, right? So Seth Rogen, if you've seen this movie, has a one-night stand. What are the chances? A one-night stand with Katherine Hagel. Good deal, right? So she gets pregnant from the one-night stand that they have. And he starts to get involved in her life. Part of her life involves her sister, Leslie Mann, and her sister's husband, Paul Rudd. Okay? So there's two couples you have to kind of keep track of. Now, how many of you have seen this movie? All right. Do you remember the scene where Leslie Mann thinks Paul Rudd is having an affair? Okay? So we're now going to watch that scene. And then we'll try to look for moments. I'm going to ask you after the clip, where did you see moments where the guys were orienting toward a hierarchy and the women were thinking more dyadically? All right? I want you to look for this specifically within this clip. If you're under 18, I would like to see a parent's signature, a release form on this. I will not be held accountable for somehow damaging America's youth, any more than this class already allows me to do. At which point, he gets out of the car and is stranded somewhere in Los Angeles. Okay, so what did you see in that clip? What did you see that I think tells us something important about men and women? Yeah, right here. Right. So the guys are making fun of him because his wife is really getting the upper hand right now. And doing it in a really nasty kind of way, right? With very crude sexual humor, yeah.
Being unfaithful to her, he wasn't doing anything terrible, but she kicked him out of the house because she felt that it was unfair and that he wasn't supporting her.
Right. The absence of support was really painful for her, really costly. And she said at one point, this is worse than you sleeping around. This is worse than that. What else did you see that sort of gets at this dyadicness versus the hierarchy? Yeah. That's right. That's where the bond is, right? And the Seth Rogen character is supporting Paul Rudd, but it's like, no, I just get it. That's what guys are about, right? It doesn't feel as like a dynamic emotional relationship. Just like cut the guy his slack, like he's living his life. What else did you see? Yeah.
I think back to the support. Seth Rogen's character was like, whoever Paul Rudd's name. Paul Rudd is awesome, and Leslie Mann's character sucks or something like that.
Right.
Like ranking them.
Right, because Leslie Mann is annoying, which is interpersonally pain in the ass, and Paul is awesome. That's a hierarchy, right? What else do you see? Yeah.
The woman was wanting to
Uh-huh.
For him to feel closer in space.
That's right. So it's really interesting that what he's doing, and he said this, sometimes I just need time to myself. And that you might say, well, how does that relate to the hierarchy? That means the hierarchy is so pressing at sometimes that guys just need to get out of it. Guys just need to check out. And she would say, I need time to myself, but I kind of want to go to a movie with you, and that's how I'm going to do that. Right? So the way that I feel good about myself is Paul Rudd hanging out with his buddies and playing, doing this fantasy baseball, just checking out of the hierarchy, saying, that's what I need to get downtime. I need to go see a movie. I need to not really be part of the whole social world. And she says, no, I need more of that. That's what I need. That's how I get nurtured.
I think it was interesting saying that by doing that, that was making him feel closer to her.
That's right. That's right.
Whereas she interpreted it as you're distancing yourself, and I felt distant from you.
Being away from the relationship allows me to get closer to you. It allows me to understand you better. I come in a healthier, better way. And that was foreign language to her. What's he do in his spare time? He's not going to watch Bridges of Madison County, right? A chick flick. He's going to watch Spider-Man. And what's he doing with his buddies? They're not crocheting things. It's not a book club. They're creating a structure where someone's going to win in the draft and somebody's going to lose. It's a league where somebody wins and somebody loses. What else? Yeah, Jason.
A lot of those conflicts arise just because of these differences, but a lot of guys like de-stress by being alone after a hard day.
Yeah.
Having a beer, and a lot of women like talking about it. It's not to say that some women don't also like talking or like being alone.
Yeah.
And not to say that some guys don't like being with people.
Right.
I think a lot of it's not about who's right or wrong. It's just differences and conflicts that come up when people don't understand why. Why don't you think like that?
Right, there's different styles about how we all want to de-stress, right? And if our partner doesn't know how we like to de-stress, we're going to have some friction, right? So the point being made is that he likes to de-stress and get away from things, have a beer, and just be left alone, right? She probably likes to say, how was your day? I want to tell you about how my day was. And that is the making for moments that can be very toxic, right? But if you understand what your partner's trying to do, if you're understanding what they're about, then you can say, oh, that's it. I don't take it as a bad thing that he goes into his room, his man cave. By the way, how many of you in this room are female and have a woman cave at home? How many of your moms have a woman cave at home, right? I was moving into my house a long time ago. There was this little shack in the back. And it wasn't bigger than this. Like it was, like you couldn't stand up and not touch a wall. It was tiny. And there was a moving guy coming into my house. And he had by the way, it wasn't a moving lady. It was a moving guy. And he brought this big something or other. And he looked out in my backyard and he said, wow, you've got a shed in your backyard? That'd be awesome. You could put a widescreen TV in there. And the implication being, and your wife wouldn't fit, right? Just you would fit in there. So we think this way, right? It's not the only way that we think. As we're just hearing, there are plenty of women who really like downtime, really want to get away, really want time to yourself. That's the distribution around the average. There are plenty of guys who say, actually, I don't want to be by myself. I want to talk to my partner. I want to connect. And so there's variability around the mean, but the means cannot be diminished. The means cannot be dismissed. The other interesting thing, and it gets back to a point I was making earlier, which is that men have social needs. And it was for Paul Rudd, it was hanging out with his buddies wearing uniforms, right? Men have social needs. Women have social needs. But it's probably not going to be in games of sport, right? It's going to be other things. It's going to be other activities. It's not the stereotypical thing that men do. So, now, it's really hard to talk about men and women as objective categories. But I do think there are baseline differences that we can all be pushed around in good ways to be less of a stereotypical guy or less of a stereotypical female. but that we really do have to pay attention to these, what I think are core default settings. Let me show you this quote before we start talking about quickly about gay and straight relationships. What happened here? Let me just restart that. Let me just restart this. Hang on. I was doing therapy once when I was in grad school with a couple, and and it was really hot. It was in the summer in central Illinois, and the couple was coming in for premarital counseling. Not usually a good sign, by the way. There it is. And let me just finish this story. And a big issue for this couple was that they had stopped being physically intimate recently. And so there they are in the room with me. I'm the therapist, learning how to do therapy like I'm just a 24-year-old kid, like I know something, right? Therapists have to learn somehow, I guess. And so she had this really long, extensive, elaborate understanding of how their relationship had changed and what implications this might have for their level of closeness. Maybe it had something to do, this decrease in sexuality had something to do with his parents and that they had been struggling lately. Maybe he was under stress at work. And she had a list of 12 possible explanations. And he's sitting there going, really? Like, most of them were totally new to him. And he said, honey, the reason we're not having sex is that the air conditioner's broken. Like, seriously. So, men and women sort of see the same thing. We're not having sex. It must have all this freighted meaning. And he's saying, believe me, I want to have sex, but it's just too hot. Okay, so who said this? You must know, again, my reluctance to marry. In our life together, I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly. I may have to keep some place where I can go to be myself now and then, for I cannot guarantee to endure at all the confinements of even an attractive cage. Who said that on their wedding night? Not Einstein? Other guesses? Frank Underwood? House of Cards, I love it. Amelia Earhart said that. Amelia Earhart. That's, we have images of this. We immediately think, oh, this is some guy who's telling his wife, don't expect too much out of this relationship. This is going to be a sexual relationship. This is Amelia Earhart, a strong, powerful, amazingly achievement-oriented woman. So the capacity is there, and it reveals a lot about how we've learned to think about men and women. When we sort of, as I did when I first read that quote and did a double take on it, that is actually a woman expressing that. So our capacity for being human is great, but it doesn't start from nowhere. It doesn't have a random starting point. And the starting point that men have is different from the starting point that women have. So let's talk a little bit about, we've got a little over 15 minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about gay and straight relationships. There's a lot in the news, obviously, about gay and straight relationships. One important piece of news is that all of those blue states that you see there have decided to allow gay people to marry in those states. The red states, those brownish-colored states, do not allow gay marriage. Florida, even since I took this out of the LA Times in December, has now allowed gay marriage to happen. That is now happening in Florida. And the yellow gold states there, Texas and... Anybody know what those states are? Say it loud. Arkansas and Alabama, is that right? And is that Louisiana right there? That other one right below them? All right. Those states, there is a pending appeal, and they do not yet allow gay marriage to happen. But even 10 years ago, this map was red, right? So there's been massive transformations in the opportunities, the legal opportunities that gay people have to marry. Really interesting in the sense that now they really have to make an active choice, right? That's really an interesting challenge in relationships, is to say, gee, society is giving us, you and me, my male partner, this opportunity to sort of upgrade our relationship. That has to be a conversation, right? So whereas straight people wouldn't necessarily have that conversation, now gay men and lesbian women now have to have that choice. So there's sort of a linkage to societal changes that is likely to come right into the daily conversations of gay men and women. And that's interesting. You should know, as smart people, that the differences between gay and straight relationships are quite small. I am going to go on record saying that when you have an intimate connection with somebody, it really doesn't matter if the two partners are both male or both female, or if one is male and one's female. Like, to be connected, and I'm not talking about the physical plumbing of having sex. I'm not talking about that part of it. I'm talking about what it means to connect with a human being at a deep, intimate, emotional level. My hunch is that that is very similar regardless of the constellation of the players in a relationship. And the evidence tends to bear that out. As California was considering, I think it was Prop 8, whether or not to allow gay marriage in the state, experts were called to weigh in on this issue. One of the experts was my colleague, social psychologist Ann Peplau. And here's her quote from the LA Times. This is probably 3 years old. Yeah, Prop 8. 3 years old now. Letitia Peplau, Ann Peplau we call her, an expert on couple relationships, testified that studies had found that the quality of heterosexual and homosexual relationships was on average the same as measured by closeness, love, and stability. And she said, quote, on average, same-sex couples and heterosexual couples are indistinguishable, said Peplau, a professor of social psychology, called by attorneys for two same-sex couples were trying to overturn Prop 8 in 2008. It's actually older than I thought. So when you think about this issue, recognize that we don't have great data on this issue. We just don't have great data on this issue. There is a reason for that, and it's sort of ironic. And the reason is that when scientists do research, you'll recall from Chapter 2, what we want is a representative sample of couples. So if I want a representative sample of all newlywed couples in their first marriages, what I want to do is be able to go to the marriage licenses, right, and get all of those licenses and send everybody in within a specific time frame an invitation to be in my studies. That's what I do. And I hope that I'll get a representative group coming back, and I'll be able to check on whether that's the case. If prior to gay marriage being legalized, it was really, really difficult to know whether or not you had a representative sample. You didn't have a marriage license base. You'd have to put ads in newspapers, and those actually get a different kind of people than people who are recruited through marriage licenses. They actually tend to be more distressed and more unhappy, it turns out. So oddly enough, the law, as it was prior to legalization, made it difficult to know whether you had a representative sample of gay or lesbian couples. And I think we're now going to be on the verge of a golden age of studying gay and lesbian couples. And I have a hunch that most of those studies, especially larger studies, are going to be able to, are likely to say that gay and lesbian relationships are really surprisingly similar to straight relationships. But they're not identical, right? It's important to recognize that they're not identical. They're very similar, they're not identical. And I think what's really interesting to me is this second point, the sexuality and non-monogamy point. And let me get to that in a minute. The first is that gay and straight couples don't exist in the same worlds. There's a lot of homophobia. There is a lot of stress and pressure on gay couples. There is even when gay couples are allowed to adopt children, often they adopt children with, who have much greater physical and psychological needs. Even still, they end up being equally great as parents, but they often are adopting children with more needs. There's a lot of homophobia. They have a coming out process. Guess what? I'm a straight white guy. I never had to come out as a straight white guy. Right? It was all I could do to get a girlfriend in high school. I would have come out every day if I had to. It didn't help at all. But if that's a part of your identity when you are in high school and you're starting to discover that maybe you're not like other people, or gee, I'm attracted to guys and I'm a guy and I don't see all my other guy friends doing that, you've got different psychological challenges when you're 14, 15, 16, 18 years old. It's a different experience. And it's not at all uncommon for individuals who come out to not get the support of their parents and siblings, right? That can be a difficult conversation. I think it's less difficult today than it was even 10 or 15 years ago, but it's still an issue, whereas if your kids are straight, they're straight and you don't have that conversation. So the context in which relationships exist, and remember, we talked about this in class on Tuesday as a theoretical perspective, right? The social ecology of our relationships. We can't separate our relationships from the people who are surrounding us and their opinions and their attitudes and their beliefs about what should happen in our relationships, or whether we're valid and legitimate and worthy of esteem as human beings. So it's not so much the intimacy itself, I think, but it's the context. However, and again, I have to emphasize this point that we don't have great data on gay and lesbian couples, and I think that's going to change. And the data that we do know is that when there are more men in a relationship, as you go from 0 to 1 to 2, there is a lot more sex in relationships, right? So what's interesting is that in gay relationships, men have a lot of sex. There's an average, there's a mean, there's a standard deviation, granted, but on average, it's more than 2 women and 1 man and 1 woman. And often, not always, but in the course of those relationships, there can be an openness and a willingness to say, if you want to have a sexual relationship with someone outside this relationship, I'm sort of okay with that, right? So what's interesting about especially gay male relationships is that there is the opportunity and the possibility to have those. And what that means is that the conversations within the relationship have to address that, right? So that becomes another way in which characteristics that are not really about the intimate bond itself have to come into play in the kinds of conversations that often 2 men have to have about what the ground rules are going to be for having relationships with other people. It's not to say that that doesn't happen in straight relationships, because there is something called consensual non-monogamy that people are now starting to study. But it's really believed to be much more of a challenge and an issue within relationships involving 2 men. Dissolution rates, again, we don't have great data, but they seem to be higher in gay than straight relationships in one less than perfect study in Sweden that's also described in the book. And that, again, might be because of the context in which the divorces occur. Maybe there's not as much support for gay relationships as there is in straight relationships within family networks and within even legal codes, for example. Also, again, imperfect data seems to be slightly higher for 2 women than 2 men in a relationship. Nobody really knows why that is, but it may have to do with the possibility of greater emotional intensity within female-female dyads than male-male dyads. And what's interesting about that is that the more important factor, I think, in male-male relationships and female-female relationships is not the interest in another person as the same sex as you, but the fact that there are 2 people of the same sex. So what really seems to determine these issues for men is the fact that there are 2 men who want to have a lot of sex more than is likely to be happening in an otherwise comparable male-female relationship. So it's the male-femaleness rather than the orientation to wanting a person of the same sex as you that I think drives a lot of the psychology within male-male and female-female relationships. So what I've tried to do today is give you a smart, reasoned way of thinking about sex and relationships, about how men and women do and don't differ, how there's small differences that add up to create different intimate psychologies. I think it's evident in a lot of different arenas in our life. And I've also tried to give you a perspective of thinking about all the different ways that gay and lesbian relationships could be different from straight relationships, but it turns out they're not. I think in the inner workings, what intimacy really matters to me and my female partner really is almost virtually identical to what that means in male-male and female-female relationships. The similarities are potent in both cases, but we really also need to attend to the differences that do appear to exist. So thanks for your attention. We'll jump in on